Human Flourishing Publishing presents You Shall Not Languish, authored by Saifullah Alwani, read by Houssine Dehbi.
Introduction. To flourish or not to flourish. Flowers and fruits. Give it enough sunlight, water and care, and you shouldn't wait too long to see it flourish. That was my advice to my son Rawh, who was concerned about the bean seed he planted for his very first school project. I used the term flourish without much thinking, quite sure that Rawh, despite his young age, we have no problem seeing what I mean. We all know that the act of flourishing happens primarily to plants, trees, flowers, and many natural beings. If a flourishing field of crops or flourishing herd of dairy sheep would make perfect sense to you, what about a flourishing man, a flourishing family, or a flourishing nation? Before you hasten to answer, let me give you a clue. What is the difference between a flourishing tree and a regular tree? A flourishing lamb and a typical lamb? Well, you might notice that I have just disclosed a major hint for the answer. There is no difference between the natural state and the flourishing state of non-human creatures. They flourish as they are supposed to. We don't get concerned until an apple tree fails to blossom or a cow stops looking healthy and productive. Things are not so simple, though, when it comes to human beings. The expression human flourishing is often used quite loosely as a generic term of good life with no specific literal meaning. Some might think of financial success as flourishing as an analogy of a business or an economy booming and raking in record profits. Others might believe that a person is flourishing when he is happy and content or learning new things and harnessing his skills to new challenges. Given its overlapping semantic nature, it seems that up to now no single representation contains the broadness of the human flourishing construct. Let me take advantage of this fuzziness to unfold, from the onset, my outlook on this issue. I keenly believe that human flourishing is not a psychological invention, the same way that health is not a medical invention. Flourishing is just the normal flow of life. This belief stems from the Aristotelian notion of finer cause. To understand what an object is, whether it's a plane or person, you have to figure out its function. We do not imagine a plane, for instance, as pieces of joined-up steel, but as something that can carry us across the skies. Aristotle's finer cause entails that everything in nature is built with an end or purpose. Like a tree, a person is meant to flourish, and it depends on the available conditions to do so. Then, the Hamletian question, to be or not to be, stands actually for to flourish, not to flourish. Flourishing is a part of who we are. In short, we're born to flourish. This makes me particularly fond of David Kelsey's view of human flourishing, which extends the metaphor of flourishing as blossoming by claiming that it means providing fruits by nurturing and supporting others, flourishing and seeds by the flourishing of others. Such poetic tenet inscribes the human flourishing process in the present, fruit, and the future, seed. The theory of everything. What constitutes human flourishing is far from being closed. Despite its millennial heritage, the subject is still open land to theorization. Almost everyone has a subjective theory about what it is, in different contexts and various forms. From Aristotle, Epicurus, Kant, to contemporary positive psychologists. The literature of philosophy, metaphysics, theology, history, religion, economics, political science, and even neurosciences is replete with efforts to understand, engage, and teach others about what defines and stands for good life. Any endeavor to understand the subject thoroughly is thus a daunting undertaking beyond the purpose of one book. So let's avoid the rhetorical conception and dialectics about human flourishing. We simply aim more or less sketchy to give a rough account of what it is and how it differs from what it is not. Let's go far back in history and meet the unavoidable Aristotle, to look for some insights about the best way to tackle our subject. The great philosopher would undoubtedly recommend his cherished word, eudaimonia, as the best rendering of human flourishing. He would argue that this term's etymology points beyond any purely hedonistic or utilitarian interpretation. Eu means good and daemon means spirit. To be eudaimon literally means to be of good spirit. Aristotle's disciples would certainly understand why, for the Meister, modern visions of human flourishing as a simple state of feeling good is just a superficial blasphemy. For the philosopher, terms like well-being evoke a passive, physical state. On the other hand, eudaimonia is a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, and a richer property than happiness, sensitive to many more features of a person's life than just his or her inner states. I am particularly delighted by this Aristotelian moral perspective of flourishing, which I guess should resonate with everyone. It implies that flourishing stems from both virtues and capabilities. By human capabilities, we mean that make humans humans, or the nature common to all human beings. Plato. From such a perspective, human flourishing should be morally justified. This is to say that humans' good comes into existence when people make their lives the best expression of their true human nature. Nevertheless, we should not take those words at face value. For Plato, the highest way of life, as the outcome of the best expression of human nature, is the life of philosophers, lay people. You and me are to be judged by the extent to which they emulate that ideal. Is there any chance left for us to flourish? Definitely yes. Everyone can flourish. This heartwarming leitmotif comes from positive psychology, with which I'm going to grapple in the upcoming lines. Flourishing for all. The positive psychology turning point. To flourish means to live within an optimum range of human functioning, one that connotes goodness, generativity, growth, and resilience. Human flourishing requires development of attributes that exhibit character strengths and virtues that are commonly agreed across different cultures. These claims are built on the positive psychology paradigm's path-breaking work, which argues that human flourishing is not reduced in the absence of pathology. It also considers languishing as a disorder intermediate along the mental health continuum experienced by people who describe their lives as hollow or empty. The aim of positive psychology, according to its classics Martin Seligman and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, is a change in the focus of psychology, from repairing the worst things in life to also building positive qualities. In other words, positive psychology is a reminder to the field of psychology that it pertains not only to pathology, weakness and damage, but that it also has to do with strengths and virtues. In a nutshell, positive psychology is the quest for what is best in individuals and societies. A nut and bolt theory of human flourishing. One of the positive psychology advantages is its ability to build upon theories from various academic disciplines to develop practical models and handy tools to measure, conceptualize, and foster human flourishing among individuals, families, and societies. Martin Seligman, 2011, harnessed this integrated view to developing what he wishes to be a comprehensive model of flourishing. He used the following three criteria to determine what would be considered a comprehensive bundle of human flourishing components. 1. Each element needed to contribute to well-being. 2. Each element needed to be pursued for its own sake by many people. And 3. Each element could be measured and defined apart from the others. Seligman found 5 well-being elements that meet his criteria: positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. This theory is commonly referred to by its acronym PERMA. More prosaically, it means that flourishing is a state where people experience positive emotions, positive psychological functioning, and positive social functioning. Most of the time, in philosophical terms, PERMA is combining the pleasant life, the meaningful life, the successful life, and the rich social life. Another pillar of positive psychology is the virtues and strengths theory. In a pioneer work, Seligman established a list of 6 virtues and 24 strengths supposed to be shared by all humans in all cultures. This theory assumes that one can foster his well-being if he recognizes and tap on his potential of strengths and virtues, what the theory calls the personal strengths signature. When PERMA goes awry. Lena has always been a source of pride for her family and teachers. At 21, she was the youngest researcher in one of the country's prestigious universities. Lena was doing a great job with her research project, for which she devoted herself religiously. Even at this early stage of her budding career, she had good research papers under her belt. It makes no doubt that Lena is a love of a great scientist. Her supervisors and colleagues kept telling themselves. One day, Lena was in the laboratory, drowned in one of her experiments, when her phone rang. She picked up the phone and went through the conversation with her usual professional stoic attitude. As she hung up the phone, she kept gazing at nowhere for a few seconds. Then she suddenly broke into tears. She had just been offered a job in a prestigious multinational. A dreaming job, yes, except for one culprit. It's far from her native city, where she lived with her family and has woven a supportive circle of meaningful relationships. This puts her in the face of the tough dilemma of whether to accept or not. What would you recommend to Lena? Let's take the handy PERMA model and the decision-making framework. Accepting the offer will certainly be advantageous for Lena's career, yet it would compromise her relational ecosystem. The new job is promising, with a high salary and a good evolution. Still, compared to a researcher vocation, it's less engaging and less meaningful. Suppose the new job could increase Lena's positive emotions and her sense of achievement. In that case, it could nevertheless decrease her stock of engagement, meaning, and positive relationships. How will she integrate all those data to make a decision that aligns with her goals, passions, and values, to get closer to the woman she ultimately wants to become? Well, I bet that you are asking for a timeout. So let me just take advantage of your availability to submit a bundle of similar cases. The first case is mine. I did the VIA test, virtues and strength survey. I got creativity, kindness, and appreciation of beauty as my top personal strengths, while fairness and courage lie way down at the bottom of the list. I enjoy being labeled as a creative and kind body, but how can I handle situations when fairness and courage are required, when being kind or creative isn't useful or even counterproductive? For example, as a college professor, I have the daunting and freaky task of grading my students. It puts me in the face of a tough deliberation between being fair and being relevant, for I know that my course, not only mine actually, is not that decisive for student survival in the job market. Should I consider the whole curriculum when grading the students, or just close my eyes and abide by the institution's rules? In a similar vein, I summon the PERMA model as a framework in my training sessions. Every time I present this model as a path to flourishing, some recurring questions pop up, such as, should I work with all the dimensions of the PERMA to flourish? Or I am not satisfied with my VIA test, should I start working on developing my bottomless virtue? Or am I condemned to live with such virtues configuration my whole life? Such concerns make it difficult for me to ignore the PERMA model's serious issues in practical life. It reflects how confused people get in their attempts to balance each well-being components weight in real-life situations. Even if we assume that we have cultivated our PERMA's full set, as we bring all those elements to bear on life's ebbs and flows, we realize that it's not enough to be happy. This, I argue, is the first limitation of the PERMA model. It doesn't provide a handy framework to handle how flourishing components interact. Above all, when they are at odds, if it's true that the axiomatic assumption of independence facilitates the scientific handling of each well-being component. Yet, outside of the laboratory, rarely do our activities and decisions entail one dimension separately. The PERMA is a helpful model that theoretically orients people towards adapted behaviors and worthwhile ends. Yet, pursuing each of its elements separately may not necessarily lead to the optimal level of flourishing. Even worse, pursuing an element may be detrimental, as it could conflict with other people's goals or induce harm to oneself or others. Some scholars claim that this difficulty in choosing between competing routes to well-being, that is, the aggregation and adjudication issue, is one of the wicked problems in the field of positive psychology. Phony flowers never blossom. Let's turn to what's sense for a good life, as it could be envisioned by the much envied middle class. You know, those people who enshrine the legal drug called ambition. Those diligent newspaper readers and law-abiding citizens who, thanks to casuistic, can feel very ethical even when they work for a tobacco company or a bank. Those people who can indulge themselves into visiting any place reached by low-cost flight companies and who can spend their entire life captive in a corporate structure, very cautious about filling lines in their resumes, condemned to manage lunatic bosses and very sensitive to the ever-dangling carrots of promotions and raises. Is this what a flourishing life is? Let's turn to Genghis Khan, who used to find happiness in conquering one's enemies, in driving them in front of oneself, in taking their property, in savoring their despair, in outraging their wives and daughters. The inglorious warrior had indeed spent his life according to this ideal. Similarly, in one of his famous poems, the Arab poet Al-Mutanabbi calls us to not consider glory to repose in wine or singing slave girl. Glory is to be found only with the sword and in pristine violence, in lopping off the heads of kings and in witnessing whirlwinds of black dust and a looming army. Can we consider all those people as examples of flourishing men? If individual flourishing leads to collective languishing, would it still deserve to be seen as such? These reflections lead us to another limitation of the PERMA model. It shows how it does not provide clues for discerning worthwhile ends to pursue in specific contexts. When Seligman stated that each element in his model must contribute to well-being, he did not explicitly differentiate between individual and collective well-being. This is, in my sense, a yawning hole in the model's practical usefulness. It depends. Unbalanced PERMA seeks executive. As my wonder for the PERMA model wanes, my skepticism went in the opposite direction, and so did my loneliness. Don't go ahead of yourself, I kept telling myself whenever doubts popped up on the surface of my mind. I learned to cope with my helplessness in taking on the PERMA model until I found out that I wasn't actually alone. Skepticism over PERMA's simplistic appliance is indeed shared by many thinkers who have enough credentials to speak up their minds and get listening ears. The first is one of the big guns of positive psychology, Christopher Peterson. In his book, Pursuing the Good Life, whose following words made my day. Positive psychology should study doing the right thing. All too often, this is not the focus of research. Rather, studies look at what makes people happy, healthy, or wealthy. Sometimes, the right thing produces none of these wonderful outcomes. The right thing remains the right thing. But what is the right thing, you might wonder? Is being cautious the right attitude? Yes. Look before you leap. But so the bravery and risk determination, because he who hesitates is lost. Is being talkative and outspoken a virtue? Yes, of course. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. But so is taciturnity and quietness, because the goose that honks gets shot. It depends. This is the obvious answer. The deployment of any of the virtues is context sensitive. There is no size-fits-all solution. This echoes with what Aristotle used to call the priority of the particular, since he did not believe that appropriate action could be determined exclusively by following formulas and rules. This is why he said that pursuing a good life is more of an art than a science. While very elegant as a theory, the PERMA model needs a pivotal ingredient to be enacted. It needs an executive. This executive sends forward the faculty to decide what to do, at what amount and what time. For Aristotle, living well is about cultivating excellence to become the best kind of person one can be. not by following rules that restrict behavior in absolute or universal terms. To carry on a good life, we should use our emotional, physical, and intellectual capabilities to pursue worthwhile ends, considering the specific circumstances, the specific people, at a specific moment in time. This ability to leverage reason, emotion, and action to do the right thing is what Aristotle defined as phronesis, known as practical wisdom or prudence. Given its regulatory power, phronesis is the master virtue without which other virtues would exist like well-intentioned but an unruly child. While the positive psychology advises people to leverage their strengths to get a better life, experience tells that virtues and strengths are not sufficient, in general, if exercised independently. Without practical wisdom, strengths and virtues, however well developed, cannot be effectively deployed. Practical wisdom lies in the center of Aristotle's conception of the good life, insofar as one cannot flourish if it doesn't cultivate it. A wise person can fathom what is best in each circumstance and then acts wholeheartedly towards it. Practical wisdom enhances one's ability to perceive deliberately and do the right thing while integrating rightly ordered emotions, cognitions, and intentions. When a person possesses practical wisdom, he can display virtues such as courage, honesty, temperance, and similar virtues in proper amounts and the right contexts. If phronesis could be squeezed into one word, it would certainly be this one: context. Most real-life issues are not only about which ingredient to deploy, they are also about how much of an ingredient is needed. In the realm of virtues, more is not necessarily better. Too much of a given virtue can hinder eudaimonia as too little. As such, to be considered virtuous, we need to know how kind or honest or empathic or loyal we should be, as virtues need to be perpetrated in the right proportions. They need to be cultivated and deployed on the right extent. Aristotle highlighted the importance of finding the right dose in any action. Courage is about finding a balance between cowardice and recklessness, but such equilibrium is not the midpoint on some scale. It's a mean that will vary from context to context, from situation to situation. To find this mean is not a simple calculation like finding the arithmetic midpoint. It's an intricate process of deliberation and perception of what is idiosyncratic in each particular circumstance, context, and situation. Why is it not easy to deliberate between competing ends to develop the possible right actions needed to pursue human flourishing? An overarching answer is provided by Barry Schwartz, who summarized it in the triptych relevance, conflict, specificity. First, life does not come labeled with the specific perma elements we need to tap on to be happy. This raises the problem of relevance. Do my circumstances provide meaning, positive emotions, achievement, or other sources of flourishing? Does this specific situation require courage, honesty, compassion, justice, or some other strengths? Secondly, conflict arises when real-life situations put flourishing roots at odds, as we saw in Lena's case mentioned above. Conflict can also occur among needed virtues. Should I be fair or kind in assessing my student papers? Finally, flourishing elements and virtues lack the specificity required to be translated into actions. What do fairness and equity require of me in grading my students? What would be the honest response to my son's question about how good he was in a scored piece of theatre? How can I foster proper positive emotions amid this particular tense situation, whether it's a business meeting, a funeral, or a wedding ceremony? It takes knowledge, creativity, imagination, perspective, and experience to translate every flourishing ingredient into fruitful actions in any situation. In a nutshell, it takes practical wisdom. Every perma element needs to deal simultaneously with the problems of specificity, relevance, and conflict. If we remember the flourishing plant metaphor, talking about the perma without practical wisdom is similar to talking about the manure that helps plants grow without telling you that every plant flourishes its way, that it depends on particular circumstances, particular weather, particular soil. This leads us to our cornerstone argument about the centrality of wisdom for flourishing, as it fits perfectly with the PERMA framework. Wisdom will be needed for emotional governance, meaningful work, good relationships, and worth pursuing goals. Wisdom adds virtue to each PERMA. Without virtue, every one of those 5 components is just a phony. By acting as the golden executive, wisdom will make PERMA closer to the eudaimonian ideal, which is, according to Plato, the good composed of all good, an ability which suffices for living well. Perfection in respect of virtue, resources sufficient for a living creature. This is why practical wisdom is sometimes described as a combination of moral skill and moral will. Let me close this reflection by quoting my beloved hero, Barry Schwartz. By embedding practical wisdom in the scientific study of the good life, I argue that positive psychology is better equipped to help individuals achieve human excellence, become the best one can be, and ultimately do the right thing. I couldn't agree more. Wisdom as the human flourishing. By now, I suppose that we are keenly aware that practical wisdom is the enabler of all human flourishing ingredients. It's what allows each individual to translate an abstract definition of the good, like being kind or being courageous, into concrete actions perfectly fitting with the context and its idiosyncrasies. Yet, wisdom is much more than a mere component of eudaimonia. At its core, wisdom is the very ability to live well. It's a way to figure out the optimal ways to build a good life, as it's artistically featured by James Oppenheim. The foolish man seeks happiness in the distance. The wise grows it under his feet. Wisdom is indeed about what matters and what we do about it. Wise people do not only know how to live, but they also do live well. As Garrett College put it, living well, living better, or living the good life is what lies behind our interest in wisdom. Wisdom is indeed the golden gate toward a deep understanding of human flourishing, as it offers new insights about its nature and its scope. The first critical insight has to do with the scale of human flourishing measurements. Having practical wisdom is to be endowed with a capacity which makes one good at thinking about what one should do, not to achieve particular goals, but to live a fulfilled and worthwhile life as a whole. These words remind us of Aristotle, for whom you should wait until your last breath to judge if you had lived a flourishing life or not. This means that the appraisal of flourishing should be perpetrated to the entire lifespan. For Aristotle, a flourishing life is a description of how one's life takes shape on a whole, as one continues to grow and become the best version he can be, given that the ebbs and flows of life can undermine or enhance our ability to flourish. A life of virtue and human excellence should therefore be characterized by a virtuous ending. Yet, we should not forget that a long life of wisdom comes from everyday decisions. Wisdom can help us design our life's whole shape by choosing which specific human flourishing pattern is the best for us. I am quite suspicious about my chaotic thinking style to convey the core idea I struggle to shape within this chapter. Let me then remind it overtly in a few words. Human flourishing is likely to emerge when the active pursuit of happiness is done wisely. It's the outcome of the encounter of well-being and wisdom. It's that simple. Yet, God knows how this encounter is hard to arrange and sustain. Every missed appointment between wisdom and well-being creates the conditions for the hideous beast to permeate our world. It opens the way to human languishing.